From doing military funeral honors, I've met a lot of people that were in that war in the aftermath of 9/11, and a lot of people that had joined because of 9/11. And it was an incredible experience to perform those kind of ceremonies for their fallen comrades. And it's just an incredible feeling. My name is Ryan Spires. I was in the U.S. Navy for 5 years. I was a steelworker second class, and for the first 4 years, I was in a Naval Mobile Construction Battalion unit, and for the last year, I did military funeral honors.
My name is Ben Scotty. I'm a 6-year Navy veteran. I worked as an aviation maintenance administration man in about 9 different squadrons over a period of 6 years.
I definitely felt like it was a calling. I also felt like it was an honor because these people, it's their last moments. It's their last moments to say goodbye to their loved one. And when I think about that, when I'm presenting that folded flag to their next of kin, and they're looking at me and they're looking for some kind of words of encouragement, and it's an honor to be the one to comfort them in that way.
I was in 4th grade, and they kept us in the dark the whole day. They wouldn't, because who wants to tell 4th graders that the country's at war?
When I think about those things, especially when I was in uniform, I felt like I was honoring them and everybody else who had lost their lives in the war after that, because I was still here. I could represent them. I could be a symbol for honor and hope and commitment, really, to our country.
They lined us up for our buses, and all the teachers, the guidance counselor, and the principal were asking students if they knew where their parents were. And because my town, I'm from a town called Burnsville, New Jersey, which was an hour away from New York City. So most of the people in our town commuted every morning and were actually in the city that day.
It made me think about what those people went through, especially the people that were on the planes who had realized what was happening, and the people that crashed in Pennsylvania. It made me think about the families. When I went to Washington, D.C. and saw the crash at the Pentagon, it hit me, because it made me realize that these were actual people. It wasn't just a story that you're told when you're a kid.
At 8:46 on the morning of September 11th in 2001, a plane flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 19 years later, we, as a country united, still pause at this moment in time in solemn remembrance of the lives that were lost and the lives that were forever changed by the events of that day. We remember the images, we remember the feelings, we remember the faces, and we remember the names.
This poem is called The Names. It's by the American poet laureate Billy Collins. And Billy Collins wrote this poem last year in commemoration, in celebration, I would say, in remembrance of the 2,792 souls who perished that day on September 11th. The names. Names etched on the head of a pin. One name spanning a bridge, another undergoing a tunnel. A blue name needled into the skin. Names of citizens, workers, mothers, and fathers. The bright-eyed daughter, the quick son. Alphabet of names in a green field. Names in the small tracks of birds. Names lifted from a hat or balanced on the tip of the tongue. Names wheeled into the warehouse of memory. So many names, there is barely room on the walls of the heart.
I know a poem. This old town's been here as long as I remember. This town's gonna be here long after I'm gone. East side, west side, take a close look round her. You've been home. You will always be in my bones.
If I could have the world my way, honestly, I think we would all just, live your life. Every neighbor knows each other. Everyone is happy. And where I live, I know every single one of my neighbors. I know all of them, and they know me. And we exchange gifts, and I bring them jam and they bring me pie. And I wish that the world could be like that. I wish that everyone could just accept that we're different. I want to be able to go all over the world and just feel welcome. And I want them to feel welcome when they come to our country.